Hey everybody, this is unusual to have two videos in 2 days. This is going to be a response to a comment that I got on yesterday's video about he who owns the guns owns you. And I'm replying to it because it's a comment that a lot of people think. It's very common in the debate, and so it's worth replying. As soon as I start thinking about making a textual response, I realize that's just silly because the only person we'll see will be the person who commented in all likelihood. So if it's a good topic, if it's a good thing to put out there, then I'll just make a video of it, which is what I'm going to do here. So, obviously most of the people who saw my video are subscribers, and they tend to be libertarians, and they tend to agree. I don't know if this person's a subscriber, if they're a libertarian or not. I don't know how they came across my video since it doesn't say, like maybe they are a subscriber, maybe they're not, but they say that they live in England. And the arguments they're going to make are ones that you hear an awful lot in this debate. And I have made videos on this before, going way back 10 years, but it's due for a redone. So here we have Andrew J.S. comments. It looks like he edited it at some point, so I don't know what he changed, but the pith of the argument is still there. Consider this. I live in the UK, and in London, there hasn't been a single gun homicide since the 21st of October last year. London has a population of 9 million. Also, there have only been 37 homicides in a total this year in London, compared to more than 200 in Chicago, which has a population of 2.7 million. But that's another topic, and that's as far as it goes. And this is something that you could go into a lot of detail on, but you don't have to go into a lot of detail. Just to kind of get the gist, look, we've got this country has much lower homicide than the United States. He doesn't say anything in here about the gun laws in the UK, but I guess it goes without saying that they have much more restrictive laws, much lower ownership rates, much lower numbers of guns per capita, and certainly in total numbers. And so, I guess we're supposed to consider that. He doesn't make too much of an explicit point. I think it's just supposed to be obvious on its own. And, there's a lot of logical problems and empirical problems with, I think, what's being tried to be stated here, but it's completely true that for, millions of people out there, this is basically the clincher argument. This is the mic drop. This is the moment where the debate is over, and it's just now something that you can't debate. Just the differences are so huge that they must prove something. Now, there's a couple things to be said about that. One is that it seems to have the reliant on a logical fallacy. So it seems to be like there's this idea that, well, if correlation equals causation, right? If there are restrictive gun laws in the UK and low homicide, that must be because of the restrictive gun laws. Or contrary to that, if there's high crime in the United States, high homicide, relatively speaking, there's not on a world scale, but compared to the peer countries that we always are supposed to be compared to, which is itself an interesting topic, right? Why should the United States be compared to the UK and Australia, Liechtenstein, Sweden, the Netherlands, Brussels, Belgium, Slovenia, but not Mexico or Brazil or Russia? Countries that are, like a lot of the countries are small, homogenous, very wealthy states like Sweden or Finland, Norway, Denmark, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. I may see Luxembourg listed in a lot of these, but like not with Mexico, even though, we have a common history, we have a common border, we have millions and millions of people that cross the border all the time. There's millions and millions of Mexicans and people of Mexican descent in the United States. There's probably millions of Americans in Mexico, and where our economies are just completely intertwined, and yet we shouldn't compare it to Mexico. We should compare it to Luxembourg, right? I think that raises some interesting questions. It seems, and I'm not saying there's something to this, but there's a slight irony here, because it does seem like, well, we're only supposed to compare the United States to white countries. We can't compare it to countries that are brown or black, right? So we're not going to compare it to Angola, Zaire, South Africa, which by other metrics is considered a first world country. It's a wealthy country. and it usually is included in lists of wealthy countries. But when you do a list of homicides, it's much higher than the United States. It's way, way higher than the United States. In fact, it completely ruins any correlation. If you look at like the G20, it has to be excluded because if you don't, then there is no correlation between gun restrictions or gun ownership rates and homicide rates. So most of these attempts to find uh, a correlation are based on cherry picking, and that's the other thing. Let's accept that the UK has very low homicide and the U.S. has very high homicide. It's two data points, right? You can't establish anything from two data points, or you can establish very, very little. It's like the people who are trying to decide what are the odds that there's life in the universe because there's life on the one planet we know the most. Well, we only have the one data point. There's not a lot to go off of. But it's also, like I said, just based on a logical fallacy. There could be other reasons, and the fact that there might be correlation doesn't prove that there's causation. The other thing is that you're not actually showing correlation when you do this for the reason I just outlined there. That you're only comparing two countries. You're not really establishing correlation from doing that. If you look around if you do all the countries in the world, there's none, right? Because you have all the countries of Latin America, whether they be in South America, in the Caribbean, or in Mesoamerica, they all have much higher homicide than the United States, and with one or two exceptions like Uruguay, they have very, very restrictive gun laws, on at least as restrictive or even more restrictive than they have in the UK, and yet their homicide is super high. And the same is true with Africa, and the same is true with much of Asia. Homicide rates in China are high. Homicide rates in Russia are very high. Homicide rates in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Cambodia, they're all very high, and yet these aren't countries that have Second Amendments. They don't have a militia history. They don't have anything equivalent to an NRA. They don't have yeah, anything like that. And we're just not going to count. So we can compare the United States to like a handful of Nordic countries, Iceland, but not with Russia, not with Brazil, not with Mexico or Guatemala, El Salvador. They don't even want to compare it to Mexico or to Canada in many cases. So there's no. And the other problem is there isn't a linear correlation between these societies. So like England, and this is the big problem. If you have a society that has low homicide, and it's got a very low homicide rate. The example I always like to use is because I'm most familiar with it and because it's such an outlier is Iceland. Iceland has a tiny, tiny homicide rate. They've got like 300,000 people, and there are no murders in most years. They have a murder every couple years, so the homicide rate is, I think, it's like 0.1 per 100,000. The most common, there's other ways you could obviously measure it, but most statistics, at least in the U.S., are compiled in homicides per 100,000, right? So Iceland's very, very low. It's usually the lowest, or I mean, obviously you have like the Vatican City, and I think maybe Malta or Andorra, but like other than that, that's where it is. It's like the lowest country that's still kind of like a country, and their gun laws are a mix, right? So they're pretty open about long guns, shotguns, and rifles are pretty easy to get, and there's a high proportion of them in society. Handguns are banned, and let's say tomorrow the Icelandic the Althing, their parliament there decides, we're going to ban all rifles and all shotguns too. We're going to ban all guns. Let's say that they did that. The chances are that the murder rate in Iceland would stay very, very, very low. It would stay one of the lowest in the entire world in all likelihood. It might, even if it doubled, it would still be less than, 1 per 100,000. But I'm assuming that it probably wouldn't change hardly at all. Although, given that it is so small, that a single incident, in a year could actually change the statistics, notably. But then, for someone to come along a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, and say, "Oh my gosh, look, Iceland banned all guns, and Iceland now has this super low homicide rate," doesn't that prove cause and effect? No, it doesn't, because Iceland had a very, very low homicide rate to begin with, right? It wasn't a place where there was rampant homicide crime happening. And sadly, for people trying to make this point, this is something that's true in the UK. The UK has had a violent past, but it's actually gotten more violent over the last 100 years. If you look overall, violent crime is up, rape is up, homicide is up in the last 100 years, but it was never very high, and it was certainly not. Well, if we're going to compare, well, compared to Iceland, yes, it has been very high, but compared to the United States, it's always been lower. Even if we go back to before the Revolution, before the Constitution, before the Articles of Confederation, if we go back to colonial times, the homicide rate in the United States has always been higher. Think it's historically been the case that if you compare New York City and London, so the biggest two cities for most of their history, New York City hasn't always been the biggest city in the United States. I think Philadelphia was for a while, but um, it's something like 5 times. It's just 5 times more violent. The populations in the United States and the circumstances that they find themselves in are very different from the UK for a whole host of reasons. There are religious differences, there's cultural differences, there are linguistic differences, there are economic differences, there are geographic differences. And you could say now, oh, well, there's differences in gun laws, and there are very big differences in gun laws now, but there weren't very big differences in gun laws if you go back, from World War I or earlier. It's not like the UK has had restrictive gun laws going all the way back. They don't. It was only after World War I that they started to slowly chip away at it, and it wasn't until the 96, 98, again, I can never, Australia and UK both did this in the second half of the 90s, and I it's trying to remember, is it 96, 97, 98? Doesn't really matter too much as far as the argument goes, because the pivotal years in terms of their homicides aren't really centered on those exact year, but so don't get too mad at me if I get the year off by one, but that's when they really separated from the United States. But at this point, the homicide rates are more similar than they have been at any other point. But there's even more, because there are huge differences between how countries report homicides. And so when people talk about the number of homicides, the UK does not count them the same way that the United States does. And you can say that the way the United States does is bad, or that the way the UK does is not bad. But these make differences. This really does make a case of apples and oranges. So, for one example, some countries count vehicular homicides as homicides, and some countries don't, right? The UK doesn't. So, and I'm not just talking about the United States. So, like France or Portugal or Spain, they count vehicular homicides as homicides. I don't know how they distinguish between an accidental one and whatever. But when they publish their homicide statistics, those include those numbers. And in the UK, they have a couple of hundred, people who die in that way. But people are definitely not included in the homicide statistics. But it's more than that, because the government, the Home Office in the UK, does have all this raw data. They have data on the number of people who are being killed, and they probably have some methodology that they use. But what they publish is very different. They don't publish the raw numbers. They don't say this is where we got these numbers. They just tell you this is what the homicide rate is. And there's pretty compelling evidence that they are fudging with the numbers, and that the numbers are not based on the number of bodies, but on the number of convictions. Now, there is some contention here, but I'll put a link to the Home Office. The Home Office has the Office of National Statistics, and they have a whole thing on homicide. And you'll notice that they, first of all, say right off that you shouldn't make international comparisons. So, Andrew J.S., the Home Office, says that you should not make international comparisons. And they admit, quite frankly, and this isn't necessarily nefarious on their part, that there are differences in how these are recorded, right? And so if country A counts a certain type and country B doesn't, they're just going to have a lower rate than otherwise, right? So this is apples and oranges. But there's a couple things. Let's see. Yeah, this is fascinating. So homicide index data are based on the year when the offense was recorded as a crime, not when the offense took place or when the case was heard in court. While the vast majority of cases of offenses will be recorded in the same year as it took place, this is not always the case. Caution is therefore needed when looking at longer-term homicide figures. Yeah, and I'd heard this case. I didn't know the specifics. Here it is. For example, the 172 homicides attributed to Dr. Harold Shipman as a result of the Dame Janet Smith inquiry took place over a long period of time, but were all recorded by the police during the year ending in March 2003. So this guy, Dr. Harold Shipman, apparently is convicted of killing 172 people. He didn't do that in 1 year, but they were all recorded for the year that he was. But look, notice that and there's multiple times in this piece that imply that it's not based on bodies, that it's based on convictions, right? So when somebody says, Andrew, when you say that there's only been 37 homicides, those are 37 convictions of homicides. That doesn't mean that there were only 37 bodies found. So the FBI isn't perfect. The FBI, lots of things that we could say about the FBI. How they correlate statistics, probably has some issues, but no major issues. Like I don't think that they're misreporting the numbers. And I'll put links to more in-depth analysis on this one point, but it is worth stressing. But unless they have a compelling reason, they're going to claim it as a homicide, right? So maybe someone hangs himself and they leave a suicide note, they might claim that as a suicide. But if you find somebody shot 3 times in the back and their wallet's missing on the street, that's going to be counted as a homicide, even if you never make an arrest. And that's the case. I think it's something like 50% of the homicides in the United States never result in an arrest, let alone a conviction. And, the burden of proof is relatively high. Thank God. That's a wonderful thing. But that means that you don't get a lot of convictions. If we were going to just go off the convictions, then the United States homicide is not, it's something like less than a quarter of what it reported is. So we don't actually know if we were to use the same method, like the idea that if we use the same methodology, either in the U.S. or if we just took the UK's methodology, whatever it is, and applied it to the U.S., or vice versa, took the U.S. methodology and applied it to the U.K., the idea that the numbers would be exactly the same as getting published is completely asinine. They would be quite different. The evidence strongly suggests that they underreport. They want to underreport and make things seem a little better than they are. That's not to say that there's a horrible, terrible, that it's super high, that the homicide rate in the UK must be higher than the US. No, I don't think that's the case. I think they are misrepresenting. I don't think they're misrepresenting enough, by that many orders of magnitude. But we could be wrong. We don't have the raw data. The Home Office doesn't publish it. They basically say, look, we looked, and this is the number, and this is what you're going with. But if you read that, I'll put a link to it. It's strongly implied, if not directly stated, that it's based on the number of convictions. Right, they're counting them by the convictions. They're publishing them the years that they get convicted, not when they start in court. Right, it's not even enough to to be charged. Right, so it'd be like Kyle Rittenhouse was charged with 2 homicides and several attempted homicides in 2020. Right, but the case and the incident happened in 2020, but the trial didn't happen until 2021. More than a year later. And so it would be like, oh, and now those would not actually be homicides because they were self-defense. In my point of view, they are homicides. They're just justifiable homicides. But again, those are points of contention, right? People don't view them the same. So it's apples and oranges. Just how they aggregate the statistics are not the same. The Home Office does not use the same metrics that the FBI does or the various states in the United States. And I'm not saying that the United States is better in this because in some ways there's not. The FBI is good about homicides. They're not very good, for instance, about tracking police homicides. This is something Radley Belko or any of the libertarians who have been legitimately criticizing the police for, a couple decades longer than the BLM movement. They don't publish anything. They don't track that. There's reporters. There are people who are trying to track it off of news reports. And so we have something of an idea, but they don't track that number. And it's probably for the same reason that the UK doesn't want to publish the homicide rates. They have a narrative, and they want the facts to fit that narrative as best as they can. And so they don't talk about, in the United States, they just don't publish how many people are killed by police or the breakdown of that, how many of them are armed, how many of them are unarmed, how many of them are black, whatnot. What those circumstances are. They won't even publish things like how many rounds are fired. There were some or how many dogs they kill, right? They won't record that. It seems like that should be, hey, you got a dead dog, the police shot it. It seems like that should be pretty easy to track, and yet the police unions and the various police agencies and the FBI just have no interest in that. They don't want to do it, and so the rest of our society has to kind of come together, and they're making efforts. There's a puppy side website, but so this comparison, just the metrics that they use and the methodology they use are just clearly different. They're not the same, and so we don't actually know. The best rough estimates I have is that the homicide rate in the UK is approximately double what they report, which would not make it the same as the United States. It would still be lower. But it would be higher than many states. So off the top of my head, again, we don't have the raw numbers, so we don't know for sure, and we're never going to get them because that's, I guess, privileged information that we're not supposed to know. God forbid that we think that there's more of a problem than there is. But, it's something like 2.5-ish, 2 to 3 per 100,000, which, the United States, you're looking at more like 4.5 per 100,000. So it's still going to be lower, but it's also not going to be lower than everywhere. So like I live in New Hampshire, in this state, we've got a big heroin problem. That's actually a really bad heroin problem. I've had multiple roommates who had heroin. I had a roommate who died of a heroin overdose a couple years ago. I see people openly doing heroin, and I don't want to like diss the Free State too much, but I live in the worst part of the worst city basically, and it's fine. I've never had a problem. I've never been mugged. I've never been robbed. None of these homeless people, have bothered me, but, there's a 7-Eleven a block from my house, and you can see pretty much every day people shooting up behind the dumpster there, right, including the staff. And yet, the homicide rate in New Hampshire is something like 1.1 per 100,000. I'm assuming most of those are from guns, although probably not all. And that's lower than the UK's official numbers, so despite all the problems and despite all the guns, right, guns are perfectly legal here. Like open carry is legal, constitutional carry, it's about as unregulated as the state can be in terms of firearms. And the ownership rates, I think, are average for the United States. They're not as high as, say, like Tennessee or Wyoming or Montana. They're not as low as like southern New England or Maryland or Delaware, places like that. I think I don't know if it's in the maybe middle, maybe top. I'm not exactly sure, but it's kind of average probably. And yet, homicide's very, very low. So, there isn't really, and again, to look at the case of the UK itself, there isn't a correlation there. They already had low homicide before, and if we look at even mass shootings, they just never had a problem with mass shootings. They've had 3 in their history. 2 before the restrictions, 1 in Cumbria after. And like, so, they cut the number in half. Look, 3 over 100-year period is just nothing, right? That doesn't, the big one was Dunblane. I think, I don't know if that was a school, maybe that was, or a preschool. I don't remember. It was in the late 80s. But it's just too small of a data set. They're just incredibly rare events. It's again like if Iceland passed a law and they say, look, they didn't have any mass shootings. Yeah, they didn't have any mass shootings before, so that law cleared. And this is also true in the case of Australia. As another commenter, and I'll read him because he agrees with me, so therefore I'm going to emphasize that. So this guy, Ron Hoffey, Aussie here, crime was decreasing for a decade before the 1996 legislation, which honestly, Ron, I believe I said that in the video, but I'll say it again, and you're absolutely right. Anyone can look up the homicide rate in Australia, and it starts to decline precipitously in 1988, and the legislation he, I don't know if corrects me or reaffirms, was passed in 96. So that's 8 years before. Okay, so this is not time traveling legislation. It's not like gun control in 88 and 96 made the crime start to go down in 88 and consistently go down. The only exception to this was that the guns were taken and violent crime got a temporary bump. That's right. So violent crime actually went up for a while. This also is true in the UK, and the Home Office even admits this in their thing. When they heavily restricted guns in the UK, there was a slight increase in homicides for about 7 years, right? It wasn't just 1 year, it was like 7 years. Now, I'm not alleging that this is because they banned guns, but it kind of is a fly in the ointment if your argument is that the restrictions made crime go down and that the low crime is a result of the restrictions. If that's true, then why did crime go up? And I believe it includes even homicides for 7 years, right? Well, that's just the fumes. The criminals realized that their time was up and they had to do all their gun crime before the restrictions made it impossible to have guns, and so they just committed as many. I mean, okay, it's a plausible story, but like, it's about as plausible as stories like, Lord of the Rings. It's just, completely ridiculous. Yeah, and then the other thing he points out, then they kept dropping as gun ownership rates went back up. Australia owns more guns now than in 1960, and it's safer. It has nothing to do with gun laws. Yeah, so this is another point. I've even heard John Law talk about this. Is yes, they confiscated a lot of guns. They destroyed a lot. They didn't take them all, though, and people started buying them legally. Now it's much more restricted. You've got to have cards and what you can get, and it's very dystopian system, highly restrictive, and ultimately those restrictions are going to marginally have there be fewer and fewer gun owners. So there's going to be some people who will be willing to buy a gun who won't because of the restrictions, and so the number of gun owners will shrink and their political influence will likewise shrink. So I think that's a terrible situation, but it is apparently the case that there are more guns in private hands in Australia now than there were at the time of the restrictions and just before the restrictions. I don't know what the breakdown of the type is or the diffusion of the ownership. It's probably less diffused, but also the population's probably higher at this point too. So be interesting to see. But the point is that there isn't actually even a correlation in that case. There's no correlation in the UK. There's no correlation in the United States. There's no correlation, and that's the other point. There was a massive drop in crime from 1988 until the 2000s, and even up until basically COVID. Not in Australia, not in the UK, but in the United States, right? Homicide rates. You can buy any book on violent crime or crime rates in the United States. The 80s were really bad, and that culminated in the early 90s. And I think the homicide rates were something like double what they are now, and then they just gradually fell. And there was no substantive gun control. The Brady Bill of '94, this quote unquote assault weapons ban, couldn't possibly account for this because the guns that they restricted, it was completely arbitrary which ones they picked to restrict. It's kind of silly. Oh, a pistol grip or a barrel shroud, blah 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 blah. But they didn't stop semi-automatics. They didn't. I think the magazine restrictions were 10. But how many murders were committed with those types of weapons was tiny, right? In the case like homicides, it's a case of handguns. They make up the vast majority of the homicides, and then it becomes things like shotguns, which weren't banned at all, unless they had pistol grips. But okay, you can use a Mossberg 500 and shoot someone. I mean, people who aren't shooters, a shotgun is not pretty. A buckshot, when you fire buckshot, it's the equivalent of firing 9mm rounds at once. And then, all rifles, which includes hunting rifles, bolt action rifles, black rifles with magazines, AR-15s, AK-47s. I think all those you're looking at something like 1% to 3% of the homicides, and in such a low number, it's way fewer than knives. It's fewer than hands and feet, right? The number of people who are just bludgeoned to death by another person's bare hands is more than the number of people who are killed by rifles. And most of the rifles are going to be hunting rifles. They're, like hunting rifles is in bolt action, small numbers of cartridges. They're not going to be AR-15s. There's some kind of cultural contagion where mass shooters like to use AR-15s, but mass shootings are so rare and account for such a small amount of statistics that this cultural contagion, this trope, this archetype that it's a certain tiny deranged minority wants to emulate, it just isn't even a blip in the statistics. So crime went down in the United States in the same period, and this is very strong prima facie evidence that there is something unrelated to gun restrictions that is making crime go down. And you've got lots of theories about that. Freakonomics think it's because abortion was legalized, and so all these poor women were aborting their babies, and maybe that's a horrible infanticide and a genocide in its own way, but at least none of those babies will grow up to become criminals. None of them will grow up to become geniuses or productive members of society either, but you will have fewer criminals because you've killed 40 million babies before they had a chance to pick up a gun and commit a crime. Fair enough. I mean, it's a contentious, I'm not, it's just showing that there's a debate there about why it went down. But it didn't go down because of gun control, because there was no substantive gun control. And there wasn't even in the UK and Australia until, a decade, 8, 9, 10 years into the decline. And then in those cases, it didn't continue to decline. It actually went up slightly. And again, I'm not alleging that it went up because they banned guns. It's possible. It's possible. But the evidence isn't, super good. I mean, it's just small. It's very hard to control for this. And that's the other thing. It's very hard to have control variables for any kind of social thing like this. So, yeah, we don't see, there's not even internal correlation within, and then another point I want to make, but there's not even internal correlation within the UK or within Australia, let alone internationally. The other thing I want to say here is, this distinction of knife versus gun. Yeah, so also there have only been 37 homicides this year in London compared to more than 200 in Chicago, which has a population of 2.7 million. Yeah, so it says, consider this. So he doesn't lay this out exactly, but I live in the UK. London hasn't had a single gun homicide since October 21st. There have been 37, so presumably these are knife homicides, club homicides. So, couple things. London and Chicago are not sister cities. They're not the same. Okay, yes, their populations are different, but it's not just the number of people, it's the type of people. What's the culture in London? What's the culture in Chicago? What's the poverty? What's the wealth? I'm not somebody who thinks that wealth inequality is per se a bad thing. I don't look at it as negative, but there are people who think, like, if you have a lot of chronic poverty and also a lot of great wealth, if you have a low, what's the term, the Gini coefficient, is high, then that causes crime. I mean, why crime happens, great question, worthy of analysis, but the fact is there's just more crime. And also the population is the same. Like, how many African Americans live in London? What percentage of that 9 million people are African Americans? And there are lots of Africans there, like from Africa and from the Caribbean, immigrants from Africa and from the Caribbean. But guess what? Immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean are pretty law-abiding in the United States. They don't commit a lot of crimes. In fact, Haitians, who are poor, but they're black immigrants from the Caribbean, they're like the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. They're unique in the United States in that they are the only group where the majority of their homicides are not committed by that group. So the majority of white homicides are committed by other white people. The majority of, Latino, Latinx, whatever, are committed by other Latino, Latinx, whatever. The majority of African American homicides are committed by other African Americans. The majority of homicides in Haitian Americans is committed by African Americans, not Haitian Americans. It's the only group where that's the case. Okay, so like these immigrant groups, and I know even talking about this people makes people think it's racism. No, I'm pointing out that immigrant groups from Africa and from the Caribbean have very low homicide rates in general. Now, I mean, some of them, not always the case. I mean, if you ever watched West Side Story, that is all about Puerto Rican immigrants and how they committed a lot of murders, which was absolutely true in the 50s and 60s. Right? They had an honor culture, and they would get in dance battles with each other, and after they finished, singing their soprano solo, they would gut each other with knives. But African Americans account for half the homicides in the United States. They commit them at a much, much higher rate. Why is that? If you listen to, the racists will say it's because they're just irredeemably black, and black people are just more violent. That's an argument. It's difficult to explain then why immigrants from Africa. Nigerian immigrants aren't any more violent; they're less violent. Haitian immigrants are not any more violent; they're less violent. If you listen to Thomas Sowell, there are cultural things and the culture of African Americans for much of the country. It's not all. There are subcultures in Africa within African Americans that are different, but among the urban, sprawling populations of African Americans in the northern cities, it's an honor culture. Doesn't value education. Doesn't value hard work. It values bravado and machismo, and they don't have a puritanical work ethic or Protestant work ethic, sorry, and they just kill each other in huge numbers. And London does not have a big African American population. I'm sorry, they don't, and Chicago does. And that's not the only difference. There's so many more that we could list, and the idea like, well, it's the guns. I should also point out, it's worth pointing out that Chicago actually has extremely restrictive gun laws, right? You have to have a permit. You have to go through a process. They had a handgun ban for many, many, many years. You could not buy a handgun in Chicago until the Supreme Court overturned that in like 1990 or 2008, I want to say, right? Completely illegal. So like there's so many differences, but actually their gun laws in Chicago and the gun laws in London are not that different. And the common retort is, well, maybe Chicago and Illinois. Illinois has always been one of the worst states in terms of, it was the last state to allow concealed carry, the absolute last. Every other state either had a discretionary issue, which means you can apply and the local authorities, usually the sheriff, sometimes the city, could give you a permit if they want, or they could deny you. And discretionary issue in some places meant everybody got issued, and in some places meant nobody got issued. So Alabama, for instance, was a state that had discretionary issue, but it was almost always granted. Whereas California, it was by the county, and if you lived in Orange County, you were not getting a permit. Same New York City, you're not getting a permit unless you're Dianne Feinstein or Tom Cruise or Mike Bloomberg, but normal people are not getting permits. But Illinois was not even discretionary issue. They just did not issue them. You could not become a concealed carry person in Illinois until the Supreme Court said they had to allow it. And then they refused to do that. The state did not pass any law, which meant that after the court-appointed date expired, their restrictions on handgun carrying were just voided, just became illegal, unconstitutional, and they literally for like a week had no restriction. They had constitutional carry for a week, and then they got their act together and finally passed a discretionary. But they'll say we have high crime because Indiana and Wisconsin, more so the case Indiana than Wisconsin, has unrestricted gun laws. Okay. If Chicago has high crime because Indiana has permissive gun laws, then why doesn't Indiana have even worse crime, right? Why doesn't Gary, Indiana, or South Bend, or Indianapolis, or any of the cities? I mean, Indiana has cities. If you've ever driven through that area, I mean, Chicago is only what? I think Chicago touches or is within a few miles. You can see the skyline from the Indiana coast, and it's one big megalopolis from southern Michigan all the way to basically Wisconsin, right? All the way up until you get to Kyle Rittenhouse territory in southern Wisconsin or northern Illinois. It's one big city, and yet homicide rate's much lower on the Indiana side, even though they have pretty permissive gun laws, and Illinois and Chicago don't. So yeah, something to think about. But if you do think about it, you just see there isn't even a correlation at any level. And of course, a correlation equals causation is a fallacy. And the last thing I want to point out, and I started to point out there, and then I went on a tangent, but it was a good tangent, so I'm not going to feel bad about it. It's a serious philosophical question to wonder why it matters the implement used. I don't care what the gun homicide rate is. I care what the homicide rate is. Now, so let's use the New Hampshire. New Hampshire, let's say the homicide rate is 1.1 per 100,000. And let's assume for the sake of argument that 100% of those are from guns. That's probably not true. I'm sure there are knife homicides here, but most of them are probably guns. And let's just say for the sake of argument, all of them are guns. So you have 1.1. And then you have another place, let's say where guns are banned, there's very few guns, and the homicide rate is 4 per 100,000, but they're all knives. They're all knife homicides. Which society is better? Which one would you rather live in? Which one is better in turn, at least in, all things being equal, just looking at crime? I mean, I could see like you wouldn't mind a higher homicide rate if you had a higher income or had a better life for other reasons, right? So I get it, complicated thing, but like if you're just everything else is the same and one just has a higher homicide rate, but it's knife homicide instead of gun homicide, what's the basis? Would you say, I would rather live in a place with quadruple the homicide rate as long as those are knife homicides and not gun homicides? I don't think that makes any sense. It's like if you ever got shanked, and I have friends who've got shanked. I don't think they thought, oh, thank God I wasn't shot. Like, I, um, guns have certain advantages over knives. There's no question, but knives are still incredibly lethal. Clubs are still incredibly lethal, and they kill thousands and thousands of people every year. They kill people in the UK. They kill people in the United States. People still use them, right? I mean, are you going to go to prison and be like, well, I don't have to worry. There's no guns here. Well, you can still get shanked, right? So, uh, one of the kind of points that gun control people will try and make is they'll say, look, the gun deaths go down, right? If you ban or restrict guns and the number of guns in society goes down, the number of quote unquote gun deaths go down. That's a code for saying that the number of people who use guns to commit suicide goes down, right? If fewer people have guns, then fewer people will commit suicide with them. And so the quote-unquote gun deaths will go down. And boom, now you do have a correlation. That is where you get a correlation, right? The people who decide to kill themselves, men especially, like to use guns when they do it. Women, for whatever reason, don't use them as much to kill themselves. They only use them to kill rapists who attack them, but God forbid that be allowed to happen. But if you restrict them a lot, then there'd be fewer available. And, if someone wants to commit suicide with a gun is not going to try and steal one or go on the black market to get one. If they don't have one readily available, they'll just do something else. And they have plenty of other options: leaping, jumping, drowning, asphyxiating. Like they still can do it, right? And now we get into this minutia argument, like, but the other methods are usually not quite as effective. Leaping, you have to be pretty high for it to be as effective. Like if you leap off of a 3-story building, you could very well die. You could also survive, right? If you shoot yourself in the head, it depends what you use. If you're able to use a shotgun, it's like 99.9. If you use a handgun, it's like 95. Right? So some handgun ammunition may not penetrate your skull, and you may, this just happened in the Uvalde shooting. He shot his grandmother in the face, and she walked to the neighbor and called 911. So, good on her, but it's not, whereas, yeah, if you jump out of your second story window, you might die, or you might just break your legs, and suffer horribly, right? Same thing jumping off of high bridges, some of those people don't die. But what? So we're going to ban guns so that suicides, when they happen, have a slightly lower success rate. Come on. We're abolish people's rights, take away their ability to defend themselves and whatever recreational value they get out of guns, because we want to make it a little bit harder to commit suicide. And again, they don't not commit suicide. Japan has a huge suicide, as does China actually. Has way more. Their suicides rate is so high that it compensates for the homicide rate in the United States. Or there's more people, but they're doing it. They're doing hagukari. They're cutting out their stomachs and slitting their wrists or whatnot, and they're not using guns. So it's like, well, we're not supposed to. It's not a problem then. Like a gun suicide is a tragedy, and we need to alter society. A knife suicide is just meaningless. It doesn't make sense. There's no ethical reason to weight one more than the other one, in which case making a distinction between gun homicides and just regular homicides is completely vacuous, right? And so, there is some evidence that if you restrict guns, the number of quote-unquote gun homicides go down, that criminals switch to other means, but the switch means that you don't actually get a lower homicide rate. And you say, well, but you're never going to get a mass shooting with a knife. That's not true. We do have mass stabbings. Maybe they are more difficult, but under the right circumstances, look, if I'm 6'2", I'm a pretty big guy, pretty strong. If I show up in an elementary school with a knife, none of the 8-year-olds are stopping me, and the teacher's not stopping me either. The only person who's going to stop me is a person with a gun, right? So, that's just a fact. Now, is I'm not saying that guns don't have other advantages and other circumstances. They definitely do. That's why people do like to use them. But we just don't see a strong connection there, or any at all. And again, it's like when we're talking about guns, suddenly the only countries we care about are the U.S., the U.K., and Australia. Nobody wants to talk about Brazil. Nobody wants to talk about Mexico. Nobody wants to talk about Chile or Peru or Colombia or Venezuela or Cuba or Haiti or Dominican Republic. No one wants to talk about China. No one wants to talk about Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. No one wants to talk about Israel or Finland or Sweden. Nobody wants to talk about Syria. No one wants to talk about Egypt. No one wants to talk about... It's like all of them. It's only these three, and we're not going to look at their history, and we're not going to establish anything. We're not going to notice the difference in the methodologies. We're just going to look uh, guns back. And this has become, at some level, in some countries, this has become, and I include in this list Australia, the UK, Canada, and maybe a few other Western European countries. They they have kind of they have a nationalism that's kind of based on anti-Americanism. Now, not anti-Americanism like the Russians, where they're like, we hate America and America is the source of all of our problems, right? They don't think that, thankfully, but that we're better than the Americans, and there's two big reasons. All right, they pick the dumb reasons. They could say because America is a world empire that commits aggression in the Middle East, especially, and is guilty of war crimes. That would be a good reason, right? I could understand. Of course, the UK and Canada would then be like culpable on a lot of that too, so they wouldn't really have that argument, like, especially the UK. But what they prefer to do is say we have universal health care, so we're morally superior, and we have less gun crime because we take away the gun rights of our citizens, and we will then attribute homicide rates that have always been low to that distinction, and so that's why we're better. And maybe some countries might throw in like education, but I don't know that there's a huge difference there. So that's exactly. I mean, Trudeau comes out and says we're going to ban handguns, and he says, look what happens in the United States. Even though this mass shooting in the United States did not involve a handgun, handguns are used in mass shootings. Virginia Tech utilized handguns, and I think that was something like 30 people, but political capital is made this way, and people asked me about what Australian libertarians. I know a bunch of gay Australian libertarians, and just like I know a lot of gay UK libertarians, and for whatever reason, the gay UK libertarians seems much more chill with the idea of gun rights. Every one of the Australians will argue till they're blue in the face and that guns are bad, that no one has a right to have them, that you don't have a right to self-defense. Again, these are libertarians, so I shudder to think what your average Australian thinks. So, no offense to Ron Hoffey in your comment here, but like I'm in my anecdotal experience, I don't see that. Australians seem very much against this, even the libertarian ones. But there's definitely a sense of virtue signaling and moral superiority. Oh, I'm indignant that you had this happen here. This will never happen in Australia, although it has happened in Australia. And they've had mass shootings since their restrictions too. It's very rare, but it's a much smaller country. And the way people manifest their pathologies there are not the same. In the United States, it's becoming a thing, probably in part because of the media. There's definitely a case for moral contagion here. I was just listening to Sam Harris talk about this recently, and it's actually a good episode. I've never heard Sam cry. He actually cried in the context of the police utter failure to protect the children and how they were stopping the parents. And I hadn't heard this story. A woman drove 40 minutes as soon as she heard what was happening. She, sped probably, got there, begged the police to let her in. They refused. They cuffed her. She then persuaded them to undo her cuffs, that she wouldn't be a problem, and then she wandered away, snuck around, jumped a fence, got into the school, got her kids, and got out. And he put Mom of the Year right there. But shouldn't have been necessary. The cops were actively preventing her from, saving her kids and other kids. Um, but Australia, they burn people to death. And if you look, most of the mass homicides in Australia are arson related. People go like, I'm gonna burn those motherfuckers down, as if, oh, like I mean, if I had to choose, and I'm speaking as somebody who has been burned. I was in an explosion, 8 years ago that burned most of my face off. Uh, like, I would rather get shot than get burned. Okay, it's not a good way to go. And I don't think that the victims of a mass arsoning, which is, again, a big thing, it's a thing in Australia. Not super common. I wouldn't say if you should be afraid to go to Australia because you might get arson because the rates are very low, just like you shouldn't be afraid of a mass shooting. As Sam said, I'm not even going to talk to my daughters about this because the odds, it's like talking to your daughter or your kid about how horrible a plane crash is. They're much more likely to die in a car. The odds that they die in a plane crash are so infinitesimal. And if it were to happen, there's nothing they could really do about it. So why give them terror? If talking to them is going to terrify them, and maybe it won't, but if it does, then what's the benefit, right? There isn't really one. They're going to drive more. They're actually more likely to die that way. So, uh, but again, why is a arson death or a stabbing death that's on somehow a lower, that's not as bad. That's ethically superior in some way to being shot by a gun. No, this is completely stupid. And you can't use arson for self-defense. That's the other thing. Oh, get away or I'm going to burn the place down. Like, no. If you're going to use self-defense, you could use a knife, you could use a club or a sword, but the best thing is a gun. Especially if the some button is not just someone, but it's something like an institution like the state. Then guns matter a whole lot more than matches and knives. And our states can be brutal. I mean, the stuff that they do abroad, there are certain things that make that less easy to do domestically, but it doesn't mean that they can't, and it doesn't mean that they never will. And the idea that we should just trust, and I heard this said once, and I think they were, it was a comment somewhere I read, and they were definitely pro gun control, but they said it's never going to happen because we're going to have to convince, all the pro gun people that there is no chance that the federal government will ever become tyrannical. It's not enough to say it's not tyrannical now, which is debatable, let's be honest. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's completely not tyrannical now. It's completely, whatever, democratic, and it's a good government, right? What's the assurance that will never happen in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years? There's no assurance. The future is too uncertain to make such a, that's too within the realm of possibility. I mean, sure, I could say the future's uncertain. Like, well, what's the chance that we elect a moose president? Okay, that's not very likely. But tyrannical government's not. And he was just saying that there is nothing that we can say. There's no evidence. There's no law. There's no pledge that can be made that can be trusted enough. And then the other thing, and I'll add this now, thanks to Uvalde, I'm going to add, there would have to be some kind of plausible proof that the government, presumably the police, can actually protect you. It's not enough for them to say that they will, or to say, put on their cars to serve and protect. They have to actually be able to effectively do that consistently. It can't be 1 in a million that they do. It can't be, or 1 in 1,000, or whatever it may be. It's not enough to just say, I hope that's what happens, or that's what I would like to happen. There needs to be some kind of proof, and that will never happen, right? They are never going to be accountable in that way. The whole point of government is that it's not equally accountable. The whole point is that the rules don't apply to them, at least in the same way that they apply to everybody else. There is some accountability. It's not zero. I don't want to exaggerate, but it is infinitesimally small compared to the accountability that everybody else has, right? If you had a defense agency, and if you had private security, if you were paying a private security company to defend Uvalde, they all just lost their jobs and got civil liability and were sued into non-existence. every individual and every institution that would have been involved. Because it was a police department, what's likely to happen is if any of them are honorable, which is probably not the case, they might resign, although I doubt that will happen to any. But if there happened, well, I mean, if there was an honorable cop, he would have gone in. And so, that Border Patrol agent who took can people verify this is true? It was a Border Patrol agent who took a shotgun from a barber shop that he was at, and that's who killed the shooter. I don't know if that's true. I've heard that now multiple times, but I've not confirmed that to my own satisfaction at this point. But what's likely going to happen is some of the officers might be put on administrative paid leave. There'll be an internal investigation, and they will either all be acquitted and nothing will happen, or some of them will be fired. The ones who are fired will sue. They will win and be reinstated. That's the worst that's going to happen. And the thin blue line will protect them no matter what. And it's not just the thin blue line as in the people in the comment section or waving the flags at the parades. It's the thin blue line includes the judiciary. It includes the courts. It includes the prosecutors. Right? The prosecutors are. It seems like we have reached a stage where there's certain things that will be done. Like if a cop commits a crime on their own, not in the commission of their duties, then they could get charged. Although even then, they often walk. Cops get pulled over for drunk driving all the time and are just let go. And you can watch body cam images where they don't. Those are the ones that get live, but you can clear that they expect that. Cop to cop, just let me sleep it off. I watched one from northern Michigan, where I'm from, where it was clear he had every expectation of walking away, and the guy's like, I want to, but it's body cammed, right? I can't now. But the other thing is apparently now, if you kill a black person, even or shoot one, even if you don't kill them, there'll be such a huge outrage. The juries will feel such that you might get convicted of something, But, in the case of like Jacob Blake, Jacob Blake was a more justifiable, shooting than most people would be willing to acknowledge. But something like Uvalde, failure to defend somebody, that's never going to be a crime, right? And until that happens, then I don't know what the fuck people are talking about you don't have to defend yourself. The police, no, they won't. They have no obligation to. And there's no, I can't even imagine hypothetically a way that could happen. But, if someone wants to make the argument, they can. But the idea that, if we just restrict guns, you won't need to be protected. Bullshit. You can still get killed, murdered, raped, robbed by criminals armed other ways, and indeed armed by guns. You can't stop. Even in the UK, even in Australia, they still have gun homicide. They still have gun homicides in Japan and China. It still happens, right, despite the restrictions. So... And I did see in the Home Office report, which I'll put a link in the description, they said of all the guns that are used in crime, it was something like only one was a registered firearm. So, and there's you can find all these videos of the London police confiscating all these weapons that are not registered. So how is that a thing, right? How is that possible? I thought gun control, and all those black market weapons, they're not circulating among law-abiding citizens who just want to defend themselves. They're circulating among criminals. So the law-abiding citizens, their ability to defend themselves is truncated, retarded, restricted, and the ability of the criminals, it may be lessened to some. I'm not going to say the restrictions have no effect at all, but now, relatively speaking, they're better armed, right? And this might be reflected in the fact the homicide rates and violent crime actually went up slightly, but still notably for 7 years after the ban. It'd be one thing if it was 1 year. That's just a blunt. 7 years, it's 7 times harder to explain than just one. Anyway, the comment had a lot of these very common ideas that many people. I feel like this is the one point that just. And there's subtlety to it. A lot of Americans they feel inferior. They want to be like Western Europe. And again, a lot of Western Europeans, and I include in that Australians and Canadians, want to virtue signal how much morally superior they are to the United States, and they can do that by saying they don't have universal health care it's all private healthcare, and there's no government assistance at all for people who get sick, and the government doesn't spend a penny on healthcare for anyone. So and also, all every child is getting shot in the face by a crazy person. So, and they don't do anything about it because the NRA runs the United States, and they fuel they're literally vampires who drink the blood of children to sustain themselves. So yeah, it feels good to believe that, but it's also completely rubbish. So anyway, thanks all for watching, and have a great day. Goodbye.